Do you believe in life after death? What if we tell you right now that there are real, documented cases that actually prove exactly that? If you think nothing comes after death and that there must be a logical explanation for everything, then we're already incredibly curious how you're going to explain these 10 mysterious cases. So let's jump straight into the first one, and this one will change your idea of life and death forever. Number 10. Mysterious messages from the afterlife. There are reports about life after death that are so precise and so well documented that even the biggest skeptics start to seriously question their beliefs. One of these cases is still regarded as one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for the soul continuing after death. It's about Henry and Eleanor Sidgwick, a married couple who were among the most important researchers of their time. Henry Sidgwick was a highly respected philosopher at the University of Cambridge and one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. This organization was the first of its kind that tried to study paranormal phenomena using scientific methods. Henry wasn't a dreamer, but a thinker who dedicated his life to the search for truth. His wife, Eleanor Sidgwick, was no different. She was a mathematician, a scientist, and later became president of the Society for Psychical Research herself. Eleanor was known for her strict mindset and crystal-clear thinking. She was considered the skeptic among the researchers, someone who examined every detail and never allowed herself to be fooled by wishful thinking. And this is exactly why this case is taken so incredibly seriously. When Henry fell ill with stomach cancer and realized that his life was coming to an end, he talked to Eleanor about a possible way to solve the great mystery. Is there life after death? Is there consciousness beyond the body? Henry promised his wife that he would try. If it was truly possible, he would send her a sign after his death, a signal meant to prove that he still existed. But Henry didn't choose just any sign. He and Eleanor agreed on a secret password, a signal that only the two of them knew and that no one else could possibly guess. It was so unusual that it was practically impossible for any medium to predict it by chance. With this agreement, the Sidgwicks created a real proof test for the afterlife. Henry died in 1900 at the age of 62. For Eleanor, the loss was incredibly painful, but she held on to the hope that the promised sign might still reach her. Weeks later, she attended a séance, and that's when something happened that she would never forget again. Suddenly, she received exactly the agreed-upon signal. Not some vague phrase, not a random expression, but exactly the secret password that only she and Henry knew. For Eleanor, it was a huge shock, not because she felt deceived, but because it was so unmistakably clear. She was absolutely convinced this sign definitely came from Henry. Unbelievable. She never revealed what the password actually was, and that's exactly what makes this case so powerful. Because it remained a secret that existed only between her and Henry. No one else could possibly have known it or replicated it. That was 100% impossible. Many researchers still see this case as one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the possibility of life after death. Because this wasn't some vague vision, not just a feeling, but a precise, verifiable sign. Of course, a few skeptics spoke up. Some claimed Eleanor misinterpreted something or became the victim of suggestion. Others tried to dismiss everything as psychological projection. But all those objections share one serious problem. None of them explain how a secret password could appear in such a clear way. And that's exactly why the case is considered so convincing. Because Eleanor Sidgwick wasn't just another researcher, but probably the most critical and rational personality in parapsychology of her time. So if even she reported that this sign was transmitted, then this was far more than a made-up story. It was an event that shook the foundations of the entire afterlife debate. So, is this secret sign the proof that the soul really continues after death? Does it show that the body is merely an instrument, and that even after our last breath, we are still capable of contacting the people closest to us? A thought that offers hope and truly goes under your skin. But this was only the beginning. The truly shocking cases are still ahead of us. Before we continue, a quick question for you. Do you believe that we actually continue to exist after death? Just write either yes or no in the comments. We're really looking forward to reading your answers. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It's completely free and helps us keep producing these exciting videos. Thank you. Number 9. The shocking photos of the human soul. Can you actually make the soul visible? Can you capture the exact moment when life leaves the body? The Russian biophysicist Konstantin Korotkov claims exactly that. In the 1990s, he developed a special technique that allowed him to photograph people while they were dying. And what he discovered is still one of the most mysterious findings about life after death, the afterlife, and the existence of the soul. Korotkov worked with a method he called gas discharge visualization, an advancement of the famous Kerrian photography. Fingertips or body parts are placed on a glass plate through which a weak electric field is passed. A camera then captures the glowing pattern that appears. Skeptics say it's just an electrical discharge caused by skin moisture. But Korotkov was convinced. These patterns show a person's life energy, something we might call the soul. He became widely known for claiming that he was able to document how this mysterious energy leaves the body at the moment of death. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. Because according to Korotkov, death doesn't happen in one single moment. It happens in several stages. First, the energy detaches from the head and the chest area. Then it slowly shifts into the abdomen. Finally, it leaves the body through the navel and spreads into the room. For Korotkov, this was the ultimate proof that death is a process in which something invisible, yet absolutely real, leaves our body step by step. But what exactly is this soul Korotkov claimed to have made visible? Is it only a product of consciousness, a construct of our imagination? Or is it actually a form of energy that defines our entire being, independent of the body? For centuries, philosophers have been wondering whether the soul consists of pure information, of spirit, or maybe of some unknown force. Korotkov's images seem to give these ancient questions a completely new and shocking dimension. Because if the soul really is a form of energy, then in theory, it should be measurable. And that's exactly what Konstantin Korotkov claimed to have achieved, photographing the soul and making it visible. Extremely fascinating. For many people, one aspect of his recordings was especially disturbing. He reported that the energy didn't disappear immediately after death. With some dying people, it remained around the body for hours or even days before it finally faded away, almost as if the soul lingered for a while before ultimately moving on. So does that mean that in the first hours or maybe even days after physical death, the soul stays close to us living people and slowly says goodbye? A truly fascinating, but also somewhat unsettling thought. Of course, there was heavy criticism. Physicists and medical experts accused Korotkov of measuring nothing but simple physical effects: evaporation of moisture, heat differences, electrical reactions of the skin. But Korotkov countered that the patterns were far too complex and regular to be just coincidence. Especially the remarkable fact that the light fields suddenly decreased in intensity and shifted at the moment of death didn't match the desperate explanations offered by skeptics at all. And this is exactly where the credibility of this case lies. We're not dealing with subjective reports or visions, but with photographic images that have existed for decades. Images that document what we will all eventually experience, the transition from this world to the next. According to Korotkov, the soul isn't an invisible metaphor, but a measurable real force that can even be shown in photographs. If that's the case, then our body is actually just a shell we need to have experiences in the material world. Just like we need a spacesuit to explore outer space. But at some point, we will leave this shell behind to move into another form of existence. So is the soul measurable, visible, and maybe even immortal? And if death happens in several stages, does that mean we might actually witness our own death from the outside? Could it be that our soul leaves the body moments before it completely fails and is already outside at the very moment of death? Maybe as a natural protective mechanism so we don't have to suffer. Who knows? Number 8. The creepiest ghost photo in the world. This picture is considered one of the most mysterious and unexplainable photographs on the entire planet. Many people still see it as the ultimate proof of the existence of a soul and life after death, because it shows something that should be impossible, and yet it has existed for more than 130 years. The story takes place in 1891 in England. Lord Combermere, a high-ranking military officer and respected nobleman, had passed away. While his funeral was taking place just a few kilometers away, a visitor named Sybil Corbett was at his home residence, Combermere Abbey. She set up her camera in the library and took a photograph, without having the slightest idea that she was about to create one of the most famous ghost images in history. When the plate was developed, something extremely strange became visible in the picture. Sitting on a chair in the library was a ghostly figure. The outline, the posture, even the silhouette of the head looked remarkably similar to Lord Combermere himself. And here's the creepy part. At that exact moment, he was being buried just a few kilometers away. What's especially important to mention is that this photo is an original from 1891. It was never edited afterwards. The picture exists exactly like this to this day, which makes it so hard to believe. So is this photo possibly the proof that physical death isn't the end of our existence? Very, very interesting. One question many people keep asking is this: why do ghosts sometimes appear in photographs, even though you can't see them with the naked eye at the moment of capture? The early photographic technology with long exposure times was extremely sensitive. It didn't only capture what was visible, but also the tiniest changes in the room, things the human eye couldn't detect. Some researchers think that this long exposure opened a kind of window through which something could imprint itself on the photographic plate that normally remains hidden. Whether this is really the case remains unclear, but this picture is the best proof that more can be recorded than we consciously perceive with our senses. Skeptics try to explain the case logically. They argue it might have been an exposure error, maybe a servant walking through the frame and appearing transparent because of movement. But supporters insist the outline, the position, and the unmistakable similarity to Lord Combermere himself are far too precise to be pure coincidence. It's extremely unlikely that a simple exposure error could create such a clear image. And that's exactly why this photograph is still considered one of the greatest mysteries in history. It's not a subjective account, not a vague story, but a solid picture that anyone can look at with their own eyes. An image that no one has ever been able to convincingly explain. So, is this image the proof of a soul that continues after death? Is the physical body just a shell we leave behind so we can move on? An absolutely fascinating idea. If you think you've already seen and heard everything, then the next case will definitely surprise you. Number 7. The mysterious phone call from the afterlife. Can a person contact the living at the moment of death? Is it possible that consciousness and memory continue to exist independently from the body, even when the heart and brain show absolutely no activity anymore? The case experienced by the American psychotherapist Jo Rapini in the early 2000s is still considered one of the most mysterious events worldwide. Jo Rapini became known not only because of her work with critically ill patients, but also because of her own near-death experience. After brain surgery, she suffered a severe complication and later described how she entered a state that she could barely put into words, in which she left her physical body and experienced something deeply spiritual. Maybe that's exactly why she takes the reports of others extremely seriously. And one of those cases still leaves even the biggest opponents of the idea of life after death completely speechless. One of Rapini's patients had to undergo a complicated heart surgery. During the procedure, he suddenly suffered cardiac arrest. For several minutes, he was clinically dead while the medical team fought for his life. And during that exact time, something happened that no one, absolutely no one, has been able to explain to this day. At home, the phone suddenly rang. On the display appeared her husband's number, even though he was lying motionless on the operating table at that very moment. Absolutely insane. She answered the call and heard just one single word: love. Then the connection immediately cut off. No interference, no conversation, just that one deep word: love. When the hospital records were checked later, something shocking came to light. The patient's phone had been locked inside his hospital locker during the entire operation. It was turned off, and the locker was secured with a personal number code that only the patient himself knew. No one besides him could have opened it. That made it absolutely impossible for anyone to access his phone during that time to play a joke or make a call to his wife. Mary Jo Rapini emphasized that this was a documented and real incident. It's not an urban legend, not a made-up story. That's why this case is still regarded in professional circles as an authentic event for which there is absolutely no logical explanation. This mysterious call should never have happened, and yet it actually did. Extremely bizarre. Researchers who study near-death experiences classify such incidents as transcendent communication events. These are extraordinary moments in which people during a near-death experience, or even during clinical death, are able to contact the living. Often this happens through inner impressions or visions, but sometimes, like in this case, through very real technical channels. And that's exactly why this incident cannot simply be ignored. This isn't just a subjective perception, but a verifiable, real phone call that was officially confirmed by documents and circumstances. One word, one message, sent at the moment when the man's body showed no signs of life. When the patient regained consciousness after surgery, he initially didn't know that he had been clinically dead for several minutes. For him, the whole experience felt like a dream. He reported dreaming that he was talking to his wife, and was shocked when he learned that she had actually received a call from his phone. Now we have to ask ourselves the following question. So does a soul truly exist that continues independently from the body, and is even able to contact the living? One extremely fascinating thought. Number 6. Deathbed visions. What exactly happens when we die? What exactly happens in the very last moments of our lives? Is dying a painful process we should be afraid of? Or is there actually no reason to fear anything at the end? Again and again, people report astonishing experiences shortly before their death, and much of it suggests that dying is not the end, but a transition. A transition into something greater that awaits every one of us, whether we believe in it or not. The American physician Dr. Christopher Kerr, a cardiologist and later director of a hospice in Buffalo, collected and scientifically documented hundreds of deathbed reports throughout his career. His credibility makes the difference. Kerr isn't an esoteric thinker, but a passionate medical doctor, who spent decades observing patients and documenting their final hours. And what he discovered is absolutely fascinating. Again and again, dying people described in their last hours that they were met by deceased relatives who had come to pick them up. The dying didn't describe it as something negative, but as a comforting, peaceful encounter. Many said they felt lovingly welcomed and suddenly had no fear at all. What's especially remarkable is that these experiences occur completely independently of religion, culture, or background. It's not only religious believers or spiritual people who report this, but also atheists, people who are deeply convinced that nothing comes after death. Yet even they describe the same appearances in their final moments. And that's extremely interesting, because if this were only hallucinations of the brain, as some skeptics claim, then those hallucinations should actually be different from person to person. A Christian might see angels, a Hindu divine beings, an atheist, nothing at all. and yet the reports are remarkably similar across all borders. Dr. Kerr and his team heard the same descriptions over and over again. Patients said their deceased parents suddenly sat at the bedside and calmed them. Others reported that their long-lost children appeared, took their hand, and told them that everything was fine now. Some saw familiar faces they hadn't seen in a long time, friends, siblings, partners. Again and again it was a feeling of safety, as if they were returning to a place where they had already been many times before. Some even reported tunnel-like visions or a bright light pulling them in. Even though those descriptions are less common, they perfectly matched what we know from near-death experiences. For those experiencing it, it was a place filled with peace and warmth, a light that gave them a sense of safety and made every fear disappear. One of the most moving cases involved a little girl who was terminally ill. In her last hours, she said that her deceased mother was standing at the bed, reaching out her hand to take her along. For the child, it wasn't a frightening moment, but a moment full of joy and comfort. Dr. Kerr describes how the girl suddenly became completely calm, smiled, and peacefully fell asleep. Shortly afterward, she passed away. These deathbed visions often had a powerful physical effect. People who had been tormented by extreme fear and restlessness suddenly became calm. Seriously ill patients who could hardly smile appeared completely peaceful and relieved. For science, this phenomenon is difficult to explain. Sure, you could argue that the brain produces comforting images during the dying process, like a kind of self-protection. But why would these images be so similar all over the world? Hallucinations are normally shaped by culture, by thoughts, and by a person's personal experiences. But here, people from completely different backgrounds describe almost the same thing. That's hardly explainable by coincidence or simple brain reactions. Dr. Kerr himself emphasizes that he is not a religious person, but the experiences of his patients were far too consistent and far too profound for him to simply dismiss them as imagination. His decades of work ultimately convinced him that the dying process is far more than just the physical end. For him, these experiences clearly indicate that death is a deeply meaningful event that points to something greater, something we humans don't understand yet, and maybe never will. And that is exactly why these deathbed visions are more than just a medical mystery. They give us clues that death might not be a dark abyss, but a transition into something that concerns all of us, no matter who we are, what we believe, or how we lived. So does someone really wait for us in the end, ready to gently take us along? Do we all eventually return to the same place where we see the people again we miss so much? A beautiful thought that can bring comfort even in the darkest moments of life. What comes now will change your view of life and death forever. Number 5, the moment of birth and death. What you're about to hear now is something you very likely never heard before, and it will change your idea of life and death forever. What really happens in the very last moment of our lives? Does the body stop functioning first? Or does the soul leave before that? Could it be that our true self has already moved on while the body is still struggling? This extremely fascinating question comes up when you take the numerous reports of hospice workers and caregivers seriously, because they keep talking about an astonishing phenomenon. People who were full of fear, panic, and restlessness just minutes earlier suddenly change. Their faces, moments before twisted in agony, become soft. Their breathing calms down. And their eyes, moments ago searching and desperate, suddenly seem to stare into emptiness, as if they have already seen something invisible to everyone else. In that moment, they appear absent, as if they're already gone. Some hospice and palliative researchers believe that the soul leaves the body before the heart actually stops beating. This idea may sound daring at first, but it fits surprisingly well with other experiences. In near-death events, people report exactly that. They say they saw their body from the outside while doctors and nurses were fighting for their lives. They heard conversations that were later confirmed and experienced everything with a calmness that was completely opposite to the dramatic situation happening in reality. For them, it was clear. The moment the body was in danger, the soul was already outside, safe, untouched, free. If you continue that thought, it creates a fascinating parallel to birth. Maybe the soul doesn't enter the body from the very beginning. Some spiritual teachings say it only happens when the newborn takes its first breath. Only then does the soul enter the small, vulnerable body. Why? So it doesn't have to consciously experience the long pregnancy or the painful process of birth. A natural protection, just like the soul leaves the body before the dying person suffers the very last agonies. According to this idea, the body is nothing more than a vessel the soul uses for a limited period of time, a tool through which the soul collects experiences. When things become dangerous, when the body burns, breaks, or dies, then the soul separates from it, just like we would leave a burning car. The body perishes, but the soul remains unharmed. Many reports point exactly to that. Caregivers say that dying people suddenly fall into a peaceful calm, as if they are being picked up or already half gone. Relatives say their loved ones suddenly had a distant expression in the moment of death, as if they were seeing something beyond this world. It's as if the soul is already outside, while the body is still performing a few last mechanical movements. If that's true, it changes our entire understanding of death. Then it's not the body that dies first, but the soul that leaves its vessel, and the body follows. And if birth works the same way, then we actually arrive untouched and absolutely pure in this world, without having to experience suffering. So is our soul truly free, not tied down, but able to leave the body at any moment? Does that mean birth and death are really just doors that open whenever the soul decides to walk through them? An overwhelming idea, comforting, and at the same time, deeply mysterious. Number 4. Eerie voices from the afterlife. Can a simple radio be a bridge to the afterlife? For decades, people gathered in a small room in the Italian city of Grosseto to witness something. That is still considered one of the greatest mysteries in afterlife research. At the center was Marcello Bacci, an unremarkable man whose old tube radio became the tool through which countless families claimed to have heard their deceased loved ones again. Since the 1970s, Bacci regularly opened the doors of his laboratory. It wasn't a luxurious research center, but a plain room with a table, chairs, and that old, mysterious radio. Grieving parents, spouses, or friends sat in a circle, often holding photos of their loved ones, and waited. Bacci tuned the radio to a frequency that produced nothing but static noise. For minutes, nothing happened. Only the monotonous sound of static filled the room. Then, out of nowhere, the sound changed. Among the static, noises appeared. Then suddenly, entire words. A voice. A mother began to cry when she recognized the voice of her deceased son. He spoke to her, called her by name, used expressions only he would use. For the family, it felt as if death had been suspended, as if the barrier between worlds had disappeared for a moment. What's impressive is that these experiences repeated over many years. Not just once, not just with one family, hundreds of people reported contacting their deceased there. Hard to believe. And these weren't vague, unclear sounds you could interpret however you wanted. They were precise words responding directly to the questions being asked. Some relatives were strict and demanded proof. "Tell me what I always called you." And the voice answered with a nickname no outsider could have known. Absolutely insane and incredibly eerie. Many visitors later said it was the most emotional moment of their lives. Some reported being trapped in grief for years, and that a single sentence from that radio gave them the feeling their loved ones were still there, that there might be a reunion. But the story of Marcello Bacci becomes even more astonishing when you consider how strictly his work was examined. Skeptics inspected the radio, removed parts, even placed a second device next to it. While the control radio produced only normal static, Bacci's radio continued to work. Voices, answers, messages. For many researchers, this was a huge shock. How could a dismantled device still produce voices responding to questions? Still, critics tried to find explanations. Some said it might be intercepted radio signals. Others spoke of imagination or the phenomenon of people hearing voices in random noise. But all these arguments failed at one crucial point. The voices gave answers, mentioned names, spoke in regional dialects, and often responded immediately to the questions in the room. Pure radio static can't do that. That's simply impossible. The atmosphere in Bacci's laboratory was unique. Many described the temperature in the room noticeably dropping when the voices began. Some felt goosebumps. Others felt as if an invisible presence entered the room. Tears, shock, and disbelief combined into a feeling the participants would never forget. Over the decades, the number of witnesses grew enormously. Parents who had lost their children spoke to them again. Partners heard the voice of the person they loved. Had Marcello Bacci actually discovered something that creates a bridge between the living and the dead? For the people who were there was no doubt. They heard their loved ones, recognized them, and found them again. For them, it was proof that death is not the end, but simply a transition. So is it possible that the soul uses an old radio to communicate with us who are still alive? Or is this a strange phenomenon that nobody has been able to explain to this day? Whatever the truth may be, Bacci's sessions are among the most impressive and mysterious chapters in the history of afterlife research. So what would you ask a loved one who has passed away if you had the chance to ask just one question? The next case puts everything you've heard so far completely in the shade. Number 3. Experiment proves the existence of the soul. There was a man who was so convinced that death is not the end of our existence and that life continues after death, that he wanted to finally prove through an experiment that something like a soul exists and is not perishable. His name was Duncan MacDougall, a physician from Massachusetts in the United States. In 1907, he conducted one of the most unusual and controversial experiments in medical history. MacDougall wasn't a fantasist, but a medical doctor who wanted to examine things scientifically. He asked himself a simple question. If humans really have a soul, shouldn't it be measurable? Shouldn't its departure from the body at the moment of death be detectable in the form of weight or mass? To get to the bottom of this extremely interesting question, he built a special scale that was so sensitive it could reliably display even the tiniest changes of just a few grams. The principle of the experiment was easy to understand. Terminally ill patients, after they had given consent, were carefully lifted onto the large scale, together with their beds. From that moment on, their weight was monitored continuously, while doctors stayed by their side. As long as the patients were alive, the display remained stable. But at the very moment their hearts stopped beating, the scale suddenly showed a loss of about 21 grams, and it happened instantly, not gradually. MacDougall conducted his measurements on 6 patients who were close to death. He wanted to ensure that his observations weren't just a one-time coincidence. With the first patient, the scale showed a sudden loss of exactly 21 grams at the moment of death. This result made MacDougall suspicious, because it was exactly what he had been looking for. With the second patient, he observed a similar loss, even though the number varied slightly. Again, the change occurred at the exact moment of death. With the third and fourth patients, the results were unclear because external circumstances interfered with the measurements. MacDougall openly admitted these uncertainties, but emphasized that the tendency remained the same. With the fifth patient, he again registered a sudden loss, this time also exactly 21 grams. With the sixth patient, the measurement couldn't be conducted reliably because the dying process was too unstable. In the end, MacDougall had 3 usable results, all pointing to the same finding. At the moment of death, the body instantly lost weight that couldn't be explained by simple biological processes. For MacDougall, this was exactly what he had expected. He interpreted this difference as the weight of the soul leaving the body at that exact moment. He published his results in medical journals and caused worldwide attention. The term 21 grams later became almost proverbial for the weight of the human soul. Of course, there were critics. Some argued that the weight loss could be explained by sweat, breath, or other physical processes, but MacDougall countered that the sudden drop didn't happen gradually, but in a single moment, and that clearly spoke against a purely biological explanation for him. It is true that humans lose fluid through breathing or sweating, but never suddenly and never in the amount of 21 grams. Remarkably, this experiment is not a myth, not a fabricated story, but a historically documented, real event. It was reported in 1907 in newspapers, medical articles, and later in countless books. To this day, there is still debate whether MacDougall's scale actually proved the existence of the soul, or whether there was some unknown, purely physical cause behind it. Did this man prove with his experiment that an immortal soul exists? So is the soul something measurable? And is consciousness perhaps far more than just our body, something that continues even beyond death? One very beautiful thought. Number 2. The most famous ghost photo in the world. There are many alleged ghost photographs, but only one has managed to become a real icon. A picture that has sparked fascination, fear, and heated debate for almost a century. It shows the brown Lady of Raynham Hall, and for many people, it is the most credible ghost photo ever taken. The story begins long before the famous photograph. In the early 18th century, Lady Dorothy Walpole lived at the magnificent estate of Raynham Hall in Norfolk, England. She was the sister of Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of Great Britain. But her own life was extremely tragic. After a scandalous affair, she was allegedly imprisoned by her husband, completely isolated from the outside world, and eventually died in 1726, alone within the walls of the manor. Since then, legends claim that her spirit never truly found peace. Servants reported apparitions. Visitors spoke of an eerie female figure in a brown dress seen on the grand staircase. On September 19, 1936, 2 men entered the old building, the photographer Hubert Provand and his assistant Indra Shira. On assignment for the prestigious magazine Country Life, they intended to document the architecture of the house. Everything went routinely until they reached the grand staircase. Suddenly, Shira shouted excitedly that he saw a transparent figure slowly floating down the steps. Provand reacted instantly, pressed the shutter, and captured something that would later make history. The photograph clearly shows a ghostly female figure. Her body appears transparent, yet the contours are visible. A long gown, a face slightly lowered, the posture of a woman silently descending the staircase. This picture was published on December 26, 1936 in Country Life magazine and triggered a huge wave of fascination. Millions of people saw it, and many were convinced that the camera had captured something invisible to the human eye. What's especially remarkable is that the original photo still exists today and has been examined multiple times by various experts. They found no indications of manipulation or later editing. For that time, it would have been practically impossible to fake such an image without obvious traces, and that's exactly what makes this case so special. We're not dealing with a mere story or a subjective vision, but with a verifiable document. Of course, skeptics also spoke up. They argued it could be a double exposure, 2 images accidentally superimposed. Others mentioned a technical error or a reflection. But supporters point out again and again, the figure is too clear, too precise. Her posture, her clothing, the resemblance to the historical Lady Dorothy Walpole, all of this is far too striking to be coincidence or a simple mistake. The technical aspect is also interesting. Old cameras often worked with long exposure times, which sometimes allowed unusual effects to appear. Some researchers think that this might be one reason why ghostly apparitions appear more often on old photographs than on modern digital cameras. Long exposure times seem to capture more than what our eyes normally perceive. But that raises questions. If this were just a technical effect, why do we see such a clearly recognizable figure, and not just a blurry light or an unclear shape? Why specifically a figure that perfectly fits the legend of the Brown Lady? For almost 90 years, the photograph has inspired countless books, articles, and ghost hunters. It has become a symbol of the question of whether death is really the end. And the fact that the picture still hasn't been definitively debunked makes it one of the most fascinating documents in paranormal research. So does the soul of Lady Dorothy Walpole never find peace? And has it been wandering through the halls of Raynham Hall for centuries? This creepy photo certainly seems to prove it. What comes next pushes us to the limits of what we believe is possible. Number 1, the ghost signals of the Titanic. The Titanic, a name forever tied to one of the greatest tragedies in human history. On April 10, 1912, it set sail from Southampton. More than 2,000 people were on board, from wealthy industrialists to ordinary emigrant families who hoped to start a new life in America. 4 days later, during the night of April 14th to April 15th, the ship collided with an iceberg and sank into the icy North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people died. As the ship faced its end, radio operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride kept fighting until the very last moment. They relentlessly transmitted distress signals, first the old CQD, then the newly introduced SOS. The official call sign of the Titanic was MGY. They were the last desperate life signs of the ship, documented and received by other vessels on that fateful night. But the truly eerie part began years later. In the 1920s, several radio operators reported receiving emergency calls again, weak, fragmented, but always with the call sign MGY. They sounded as if they came straight from the Titanic. Some of these men were experienced operators who knew exactly what they were hearing. For them, it was clear. It could only be the Titanic's distress signal. Technically, this is impossible. The radio equipment was destroyed in the sinking. Batteries and antennas, long unusable, buried nearly 3,800 meters below the surface. A sunken ship cannot transmit signals, and yet reports of ghost signals continued to appear. People tried to find explanations for this mystery. Maybe it was atmospheric interference, maybe confusion with other ships, or even morbid pranks by amateur radio operators. But supporters point out one critical fact. The exact call sign MGY showed up again and again, and that makes it incredibly hard to dismiss. Many see these reports as a kind of echo, a trace of the final distress calls burned into the invisible waves of the ether. Others go even further. They believe the souls of the victims themselves are unable to find peace, that their final call for help continues to this day, an SOS that was never answered. This thought fits with what divers have been reporting ever since the wreck was discovered in 1985. Many describe an unusually oppressive atmosphere at the bottom of the Atlantic. Some speak of a feeling of anxiety that doesn't just come from darkness or depth, but from something that fills the entire place. Especially inside the ship, divers often said they felt they weren't alone. Some reported faint sounds that couldn't be explained, like whispers or distant voices. Others saw strange lights that seemed like figures moving through the corridors. Maybe that has to do with the enormous number of victims. More than 1,500 people died in just a few hours. A mass death so sudden and so tragic that it might have left traces that can still be felt today. Anyone who visits the wreck often says that something is present down there. Something you can't see, but definitely feel. It all comes together into a deeply unsettling picture, A ship that wiped out countless lives in one single night, still sending its SOS decades later. Not through technology, but in a way we still don't understand. In the end, the question remains: were these ghost signals just misunderstandings? Or are they proof that a tragedy of this magnitude leaves traces that haven't disappeared even after more than 100 years? Could it be that the voices of the Titanic still haven't fallen silent, and that they still reach us today as the final call for help from souls that have never found peace? Extremely creepy. So what do you think? Is there life after death? Is there such a thing as a soul that is immortal? Which case fascinated you personally the most? Write it below in the comments. We're very curious to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, we'd really appreciate a like and a subscription. Thank you.